To sell shit.
Take two.
Take two.
This is going to go great, man.
All right, hey, we're gathered here today for this Harvey Phillips Festival of Light that we're going to celebrate tomorrow. So Jim and I and Winston are here. We thought it a good idea to speak about our involvement with the formation of TUBA. And I think the most influential person is Mr. Winston Morris, who was there from the start. And what was going on there?
So I don't know. There's several histories floating around out there. Some are more definitive than others and everything. This whole thing came about, of course, Bill Bell, every time he would show up in New York after he had left New York, when he'd go back, and even when he was there, go to a place called McSorley's Ale House, and all the tuba players, if they knew he was in town, that next thing you know, there are 25, 30 tuba players in there having a party. And, of course, they had their famous name, which I won't go into. And H. Robert Riker, Bob Riker, who had been an Indiana University tuba student, had just finished at IU, and he became the tubist up in Montreal. And he was teaching at the school. I can't remember the name of the school up there. You guys remember?
McGill, yeah.
And so he and some of his students said, well, let's form a tuba club like what they were doing at McSorley's Ale House. And so they said, okay, fine. And they got the students, and Bob Riker was really the major impetus behind this whole thing. And he got a couple of the manufacturers back in those days, Charlie Ford, you guys remember that name? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if Charlie was working with Anton Meinl at that point.
Yeah, he was.
Because this was like 67, 68.
It was Getson still.
Was it Getson? So Charlie Ford threw in $100 or something, said it was $100 and you can do a mailing. So Bob Riker sent out letters to a whole bunch of people and put advertisements in a couple of, like the Music Educators Journal or the NACWAPI, National Association of College Wind and Percussion Instructors Journal, say, we're going to start a tuba thing. And I don't know, hundreds of people responded to that. I mean, he had, 150, 200 responses to that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if either one of you guys...
Well, I remember something vague. I was
in the Army.
We were in the Army at the time.
Involved at that particular point. Well, I immediately got in touch with him. And... because Mr. Bell and I, Bill Bell, who had been my teacher at Indiana University, we had just done a book called Encyclopedia of Literature for the Tuba, very presumptuous title, which we didn't give the title, the publisher did. But I just done this book called Encyclopedia of Literature for the Tuba, and Bob Riker had that book, said, well, that's going to be the Bible of the organization here. And so I got involved with Bob Riker at that point, where just right after that, he sent the letter out. And from there, we just sent out letters and stuff. The next thing you know, we said, okay, the really most logical place to really get together is at the Midwest Convention in Chicago. Chicago, centrally located. People go there for the Midwest Clinic. Jake's there. Bill Bell always went there. And then people would just crowd around these guys. So we said, well, we had these early tuba meetings. Now, you guys are already involved in this, So we had these early meetings in Chicago at the Midwest. And TUBA, at that particular point, known as Tuba's Universal Brotherhood Association, Bob Riker gave it the name. And so our earliest thing was meeting in Chicago during the Midwest Clinic, and then Jake would be there, Bill Bell would be there. We got Harvey involved in that. I think I met Harvey. Well, I already knew Harvey, but we got together like in 1968 or 69 in one of those meetings in Chicago, and then Harvey became very actively involved with it, and then we ended up putting all these other people, and ultimately this coalesced at that 1973 First International Tuba Symposium that we had here in Bloomington, Indiana, at Indiana University. I'd already done a preliminary constitution before that, with Bob Riker and Les Varner, and we met in Muncie, Indiana, at Ball State, because Riker was coming from Montreal and I was coming from Tennessee, and Muncie happened to be in the middle. So we met in Muncie, Indiana. We spent about 3 or 4 days, night and day, seriously working on a constitution. We studied the constitutions of a couple of other organizations, and we put together a preliminary constitution that we said, okay, as soon as we have this first international tuba conference, we will tweak it, and then we'll get a vote on it, and that's what we did. So in 1973, we worked on the Constitution again. We tweaked it, and we had this big vote on
One
it.
question. It started at McSorley's. How much did beer? How important was beer in
Well,
the beginning?
that was the single most important thing. It was even more important than the tuba at McSorley's.
We went there, Jim, and you know, and
you have,
everybody
you
went
have to
there.
buy 2 beers. You
Yeah.
can't buy 1 beer.
Yeah.
But if you didn't
Yeah.
have any money, and a lot of the guys were poor, I mean, Bill Bell would pay for it.
Bill Bell would pay for
You
the
could
party.
you could go into McSorley's and here's a beer, and they always had cheese. Remember? And then I remember Harvey sitting there, and he liked onions, so he had a plate of onions and a couple beers, and you know, people would just sit there and get together. It was a nice little visit. We were. I mean, I was studying with Harvey at the time in New York, and you and I would go up there and have a lesson, which meant you'd spend the whole day with Harvey.
Yeah.
And you know, and he would take you out to some of his gigs and recordings, and then you sit there and play duets. And I remember specific things about this whole business. This is where I got involved, and he just said to me, he says, you know, there's a movement coming on here, and he says, I think you ought to be teaching. I really want you to do that. And I took him serious at that. I said, well, gee whiz, that's all right. Let's see what happens. And without that New York Brass Quintet, actually none of us would have a job, because what it did was that they started hiring tuba players because everybody thought, well, at Illinois and where I was, they said, hey, we'll have a faculty brass quintet.
faculty brass
It's a lot
quintet.
cheaper than the other stuff, and we can recruit some tuba players for our band. And that's how it
I think
started.
all of our jobs.
All of our
came-
jobs were related to that.
Virtually every tuba gig in this country owes it to Harvey Phillips.
That's right.
As far as tuba gigs, as far as academic is concerned, because if it wasn't for the quintet, so nothing against the American Brass Quintet, but if they had become the predominant instrumentation, there would not be near as many tuba positions.
No.
as there are.
Any school of any caliber wants to have a string quartet, a woodwind quintet,
And a brass quintet.
Yeah.
But what you got to understand, the years that we were talking about here, 1965, 66, 67, there were only 2 tuba positions, full-time tuba positions.
That's right.
Rex Connor at University of Kentucky.
But
He
that
was the
wasn't
first.
full time, though. That was, he didn't teach tuba. He taught everything else. I mean, not only tuba, but everything
Yeah,
else.
he taught the low brass stuff, but I mean that, and then Bill Bell was hired here, I think in 1962.
Yes.
I came here in 64 to study with
That's
him.
right.
Those are the only 2 tuba positions, full-time tuba positions in the country. And then, of course, late 60s, because of Harvey Phillips and the quintet, and the instrumentation of the standard instrumentation becoming 2 trumpets, horn, trombone, and tuba rather than a bass trombone, thanks to Harvey Phillips and the New York Brass Quintet. That we all owe our jobs to Harvey for that reason, you know.
right.
And all of that was part of the motivation to get TUBA, an organization going called TUBA. And we had that first conference here in 1973, and
Well,
Bob Riker and myself, I think Les at that point was not involved, I don't really remember. We
No,
redid the
Les was
Constitution,
there.
and at that point, we also said we're going to include the tenor tuba. And so I remember we had the big meeting, and this was in MAC, it had just been completed, the Musical Arts Center. We had the big meeting, and I think it was Earl Lauder that got up and says, well, you know, that sounds great, we would like to be included, but let's call it euphonium. You know, because that's what we refer to ourselves as euphonium rather than, and I just was adamant about including the euphonium as part of this organization because I felt like it needed to be in there. And I've always fought for the euphonium being a very integral, very important part of that because I felt like it's part of the tuba family, needed to be in there. So we voted and approved that Constitution at that point, and that's when we had a national, temporarily there was an international TUBA, which didn't amount to hardly anything, and a national thing. And it was a couple years later that I rewrote the Constitution to just make it one thing. And our first president is sitting right here. And
I think the only reason I got elected is Harvey got sick at this convention.
well, no, Harvey was he would want to be on the sidelines of this to some extent.
But he got sick at this convention at the 73, and you and I.
Oh, yeah.
and then
Harvey got.
What happened? He had a bleeding ulcer. Or
He was in the
something.
hospital before the.
We put him in the hospital. And
Jeff, did you come to that as a kid? You were just a germ at that
I
point.
was a germ.
Yeah.
he had hair back then. I think.
Not much.
I didn't either.
Harvey got sick halfway through. It was in the hospital.
And then
So Dan and I and G.R. Davis
I
basically took over the
stepped
daggone
in
thing.
and took it over, and I mean, you had no idea of the what he had going on. You know, that's my first. You're going to have to pull people off the stage at the convention because it was going to run a little bit longer. You know, go and talking to some of these guys, and frankly speaking, you know, everybody sort of listened to us. It was really
It went
well
real
done.
well. It
Went really well, and I remember having to substitute like. We commissioned Ludus back then, and it was supposed to be Ludus was supposed to be played by me, Harvey, and Les Varner, right? Well, it ended up to be I don't know who. I think I got Tucci to step in at the last minute and had Nelly Bell conduct us just to pull that performance off. I mean, it was things like that, right?
The Gunther Schuller was to be premiered there, and I get woken up at 5 in the morning
Said,
and
"Hey,
you're playing Harvey's part."
That's right.
And at 8 o'clock we rehearsed all day, and open rehearsal in the afternoon and premiered it that night. And at that time it was scary hard.
Well, it's still scary hard. That first tuba
And,
part sitting up on high, what, B flats, A flats, and A's and B flats
Yeah.
for the.
And that was Toby Hanks and me and Sam Palafian and guy from Ohio, Youngstown.
Whaley. No, Whaley.
No,
John Turk.
Oh, John Turk. You got John Turk. That's
Turk.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
John Turk, yeah.
So anyway, that's the way things happen. So I wasn't at the meeting, I guess, and that's kind of how I got elected. Right?